What if I told you the God of the Bible was Egyptian? Archaeology proves Yahweh's name was deliberately erased. The Shasu inscription is ancient proof that Yahweh's origins were not Hebrew, but rooted in the chaos of the Egyptian desert. On top of that, it reveals the secret they tried to hide. Yahweh's true identity is connected to an Egyptian god, a name we have forgotten. You see, the desert was the domain of a specific feared Egyptian god, a deity of storms, violence, and foreign lands that the Egyptians both despised and strategically used. This deity's character, his possessiveness, his jealousy, his use of serpent iconography, perfectly maps onto the earliest, fiercest version of Yahweh. Now imagine you're standing in the British Museum, staring at a weathered stone tablet carved during the time of the pharaohs. The hieroglyphs are crisp, and there, etched into the stone, is the name that shouldn't exist yet, YHW, the proto-form of Yahweh. The inscription places this deity firmly in the Red Land, the hostile desert territory between Egypt and Canaan. It confirms that the deity worshipped by the Shasu, nomadic outlanders, was, in fact, an Egyptian documented phenomenon long before the Exodus narrative. This geographical fact alone suggests the entire origin story we've been told is incomplete. Welcome to Sleep Mysteries, where hidden history meets your bedtime. Tonight we unmask Yahweh's true name by following the archaeological breadcrumbs that lead to the forgotten Egyptian god, whose chaotic temperament and violent symbols were absorbed, then hidden for over 3,000 years within the sacred texts. Believe me, you will understand why the jealousy and wrath of the Old Testament God are the direct, residual marks of his true identity and original name. So, settle in and stay with me as we descend into the Red Land and the true face of the God you thought you knew. In Egyptian cosmology, the world was divided into two lands. The Black Land, the fertile valley along the Nile, where life flourished, where order reigned, where the god Osiris brought abundance. And then there was the Red Land, the desert, the wasteland, the place where nothing grew, where chaos ruled, where death waited under the burning sun. Seth was the lord of the Red Land, not just another god in the Egyptian pantheon, but the god of everything Egypt hated. And that's exactly what made him powerful. He was the god of storms, violence, confusion, and foreigners. His sacred animals were the desert creatures, the donkey, the pig, the hippopotamus, and a strange, unidentifiable beast with a curved snout and tall rectangular ears, a creature that scholars still can't definitively name. This beast, called the Set animal or the Shah, represented everything alien and dangerous. Seth's mythology is violent from the beginning. He murdered his brother Osiris, tearing him apart and scattering his body across Egypt. He was the eternal antagonist, the force of disruption. But here's the key. Seth wasn't evil in the way we think of evil today. He was necessary chaos. He was the storm that broke the stagnation. He was the wildness that couldn't be tamed, and the Egyptians both feared and worshipped him. During certain dynasties, particularly the 19th dynasty under the Ramessides, Seth was elevated to a position of national prominence. Pharaohs took his name. Rameses II's father was named Seti, meaning man of Seth. The royal family saw Seth as a god of strength, military power, and protection against foreign enemies. But Seth was always a god of contradictions. He protected Egypt from the serpent Apep, the demon of the underworld who tried to devour the sun, god Ra, each night. Yet Seth himself was aligned with serpents, with chaos, with the same destructive forces he sometimes defended against. This is the key to understanding Seth. He was never stable, never predictable, never safe. the god of storms and foreigners who rode a war chariot, violent, unpredictable, jealous. Sound familiar? Yahweh, in his earliest forms, wasn't the serene, all-loving creator God of later theology. When we read the earliest descriptions of Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible, particularly in texts like the Song of Deborah, one of the oldest fragments of Israelite literature, we see a God who comes from the wilderness, from Seir, from Edom, from the southern deserts, not from Canaan, not from the fertile Jordan Valley, from the chaos lands. Judges 5:4-5 says, Yahweh, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the field of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens poured, the clouds poured down water. The mountains quaked before Yahweh. This is not a God of order. This is a storm deity who descended in fire and smoke, a God of earthquakes and torrential violence, a God who spoke from the wilderness, demanded blood sacrifice, and identified himself as a jealous God. The scholar Thomas Romer, a leading expert on the origins of Yahwism, has argued extensively that Yahweh's earliest cult was centered not in Jerusalem, not in the northern highlands, but in the southern desert regions, among nomadic groups who wandered between Egypt, Midian, and Edom. These groups, the Shasu, worshipped a deity they called YHW, a name preserved on Egyptian inscriptions, and the Shasu lived in Seth's domain. The Egyptian topographical lists from the reigns of Amenhotep III and Rameses II explicitly mention the land of the Shasu, YHW. This isn't a coincidence. The Egyptians were documenting a foreign god worshipped in the desert regions they controlled. A god of the nomads, a god of the Red Land. Seth's cult was strongest in the eastern delta, near the land of Goshen, the very region where the Bible places the Israelites during their time in Egypt. The city of Avaris, later called Pi-Rameses, was a major cult center of Seth. If the Israelites were ever in Egypt, they were living in Seth's backyard. But it's not just geography, it's temperament. Early Yahweh is jealous, wrathful, and demands exclusive worship. He literally says, I am a jealous God. This isn't the calm, universal creator of later monotheism. This is a deity with a personality disorder. He flies into rages. He kills people for minor infractions. He demands blood. He revels in war. In Exodus 15, after the drowning of Pharaoh's army, the Israelites sing, Yahweh is a man of war. Yahweh is his name, a man of war. Seth was called the Strong One, the Powerful One, the God who protected the Pharaoh in battle. He was depicted on war chariots, his image carved into the shields and weapons of soldiers. He was the divine warrior, the God who crushed enemies without mercy. The parallels are undeniable. Both Seth and early Yahweh are outsider gods. Seth is the God of foreigners, of the people beyond Egypt's borders. Yahweh is the God who comes from outside Canaan, from the desert, from the margins. He's not Baal, the Canaanite storm god of the agricultural heartland. He's something else, something wilder. Both are storm gods. Seth commands the chaos of the weather, the destructive power of the desert winds. Yahweh descends on Mount Sinai in thunder, lightning, and thick clouds. His presence is literally described as a consuming fire. Both are gods of violence. Seth's mythology is drenched in blood. Yahweh's is no different. The conquest of Canaan is a genocidal campaign explicitly commanded by God. Cities are burned, populations are annihilated, and Yahweh doesn't just permit this violence, he demands it. Both are associated with the desert. Seth rules the Red Land, the lifeless expanse where nothing grows. Yahweh reveals himself in the wilderness, leads the Israelites through 40 years of desert wandering, and speaks from the barren mountains of Sinai and Horeb. And here's the clincher. Both are jealous gods. Seth's mythology is driven by jealousy. He murders Osiris out of envy, out of rage that his brother holds the throne. He tries to usurp power, to claim what isn't his. He is possessive, violent, and intolerant. Yahweh explicitly identifies himself as jealous, not once, but repeatedly. You shall have no other gods before me, for I, Yahweh, am a jealous God. This isn't a mistranslation. The Hebrew word is kana, which means exactly what it sounds like. Jealous, possessive, intolerant of rivals. This is not the behavior of a universal, all-powerful creator. This is the behavior of a God competing for worship, a God who sees other deities as threats, a God who demands exclusive loyalty because he's insecure about his position. This is Seth's personality, transplanted into Israelite theology, and the evidence doesn't stop there. Seth's sacred animal, the donkey, is deeply connected to early Israelite and Midianite culture. Moses, the man who supposedly introduces Yahweh to the Israelites, is associated with Midian, a desert region south of Canaan, precisely where the Shasu nomads roamed. His father-in-law, Jethro, is a Midianite priest, and it's in Midian, in the desert, that Moses first encounters Yahweh at the burning bush. The burning bush itself is a desert plant, a scraggly acacia or thorn bush that somehow burns without being consumed. Fire in the wilderness, chaos in the wasteland. This is Seth's domain. Everything about Yahweh's earliest identity screams Seth, the location, the temperament, the mythology, the violence, the jealousy, the desert, the storm, and the serpent. Every piece of this puzzle is crucial to the final picture. Let's talk about the serpents in more detail, because if there's one image that haunts the mythology of Yahweh, it's the snake, and it all points back to Egypt. In the book of Numbers, chapter 21, the Israelites are wandering through the desert. They complain, they grumble, they question Moses and God, and Yahweh's response is immediate and brutal. He sends venomous snakes into the camp. The text calls them seraphim, which literally means fiery ones or burning ones. These aren't ordinary snakes. The word seraph in Hebrew is used elsewhere in the Bible to describe terrifying, supernatural beings. In Isaiah's vision of the heavenly throne, seraphim are six-winged creatures who fly around God, crying, "Holy, holy, holy." They're celestial, angelic beings. But in Numbers, they're snakes, fiery serpents, and they bite the Israelites, injecting venom, causing burning pain and death. Yahweh sends them, not Satan, not a demon. Yahweh himself unleashes the serpents as punishment. The people beg Moses to intercede, and Yahweh gives Moses a strange command. Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole. Everyone who is bitten shall look at it and live. So Moses makes a bronze serpent, a Nehushtan, and lifts it up on a pole. And anyone who looks at the bronze snake is healed. This story is bizarre on multiple levels. First, Yahweh is using serpents as instruments of divine wrath. Second, he commands the creation of a serpent idol, despite the explicit prohibition against graven images. Third, this bronze serpent becomes an object of worship for centuries in Israel, until King Hezekiah destroys it in 2 Kings 18:4, calling it a mere piece of bronze to which the Israelites had been burning incense. But here's what's really happening. This isn't just a weird wilderness story. This is the absorption of Egyptian serpent mythology directly into Yahwistic cult practice. In Egyptian religion, serpents were deeply ambiguous symbols. On one hand, the cobra, the uraeus, was a symbol of royal protection. Pharaohs wore the uraeus on their crowns as a sign of divine authority. The goddess Wadjet, depicted as a cobra, was the protector of Lower Egypt. But on the other hand, serpents were also symbols of chaos, danger, and the underworld. The greatest serpent of Egyptian mythology was Apep, also called Apophis, the demon serpent of the underworld who tried to swallow the sun god Ra every night. Apep was the embodiment of chaos, the enemy of cosmic order, and Seth, the god of chaos, was the one who fought Apep. But in some versions of the myth, Seth was also aligned with Apep, working alongside the forces of chaos rather than against them. Seth's relationship with serpents was complicated. He wasn't a serpent god himself, but he was intimately connected to the chaotic, chthonic forces that serpents represented. He was the wild, untamed power that could either protect you or destroy you. And this is exactly the role serpents play in Yahwistic mythology. The serpent in Genesis is a creature of cunning and chaos, a being that disrupts the order of Eden. But Yahweh doesn't destroy it. He curses it, but he lets it live. The serpent becomes a permanent symbol of the tension between order and chaos, between divine authority and rebellious knowledge. And then in Numbers, Yahweh uses serpents as weapons. He commands their creation as a healing totem. He incorporates serpent imagery directly into his cult. This is not monotheistic theology. This is Egyptian magical practice. The bronze serpent, the Nehushtan, functioned exactly like an Egyptian protective amulet. In Egyptian magic, images of serpents were used to ward off snake bites and other dangers. The logic was sympathetic. By creating an image of the threat, you gained power over it. Moses' bronze serpent operated on the same principle. Look at the image of the serpent, and you are healed from the serpent's bite. This is pure Egyptian magic, repackaged as Yahweh's command. But the serpent imagery goes even deeper. The seraphim, those fiery serpents in the desert, are not just random creatures. The scholar Manfred Hutter has argued that the seraphim of Numbers are directly connected to the Egyptian uraeus serpents, the protective cobras associated with divine fire and the sun. In Egyptian art, the uraeus spits fire. It's depicted as a flaming serpent, a creature of burning power. The word seraph in Hebrew means burning one. The linguistic and visual parallels are exact. And here's the kicker. In Isaiah's vision, the seraphim are in Yahweh's throne room. They're flying around him, proclaiming his holiness. They're part of his divine court. Yahweh has serpents in his throne room. This is not the imagery of a Canaanite god. This is Egyptian. The seraphim are the Hebrew version of the uraeus, the protective, fiery serpents of the Egyptian divine court. And it gets stranger. In Exodus, when Moses confronts Pharaoh, Yahweh gives him a sign. He tells Moses to throw down his staff, and it becomes a serpent. Pharaoh's magicians do the same, but Moses' serpent swallows theirs. This is a direct challenge to Egyptian serpent magic. Moses, armed with Yahweh's power, is demonstrating that his serpent is stronger than Egypt's serpents. But the fact that Yahweh uses a serpent at all is significant. He's not rejecting serpent symbolism. He's claiming it. He's saying, I am the true master of the serpents. This is Seth's move. Seth was the god who fought Apep, the great serpent. He was the one who could control the chaotic forces of the serpent underworld. And Yahweh, in this moment, is doing exactly the same thing. He's absorbing Seth's role as the master of serpents. The scholar Mark S. Smith, in his book, The Early History of God, discusses how Yahweh absorbed the attributes of multiple ancient Near Eastern deities as Israelite religion developed. But the serpent imagery is unique. It's not Canaanite. It's not Mesopotamian. It's distinctly Egyptian. And the Egyptians had a specific god who controlled serpents, Seth. In some versions of the Egyptian solar mythology, Seth stands at the prow of Ra's solar boat, armed with a spear, fighting off Apep every night. He's the serpent's enemy and its ally, the force that can either protect the cosmic order or destroy it. Yahweh plays the same role in Israelite mythology. He sends serpents to punish. He creates serpent totems to heal. He has seraphim, fiery serpents, in his throne room. He transforms Moses' staff into a serpent to demonstrate his power. Serpents are not incidental to Yahweh's identity. They are central to it. And this makes perfect sense if Yahweh originated as Seth. Because Seth's cult, especially in the eastern delta of Egypt where the Israelites supposedly lived, was deeply intertwined with serpent symbolism and serpent magic. The Nehushtan, the bronze serpent, was worshipped in Jerusalem for centuries. It was eventually destroyed by King Hezekiah during his religious reforms, when he tried to purge Israelite religion of foreign elements. But the fact that it existed at all, that it was revered in the temple, that it was associated directly with Moses and Yahweh, is proof that serpent worship was part of early Yahwism. And serpent worship in that region, in that time period, points to one source: Egypt, specifically the cult of Seth. There's another piece of evidence that's often overlooked: the name Nehushtan itself. It's derived from the Hebrew word nehoshet, meaning bronze. But some scholars have pointed out that it may also be a play on the word nahash, which means serpent. Bronze serpent, serpent idol, a God-sanctioned graven image. This directly contradicts the Ten Commandments, which explicitly forbid the making of graven images, yet Yahweh commands it. He tells Moses to create an idol, a bronze serpent, and to lift it up so people can look at it and be healed. This isn't a contradiction. It's evidence of cultural blending. It's proof that early Yahwism didn't have the strict monotheistic rules that later developed. It was flexible. It absorbed practices from surrounding cultures, and one of the cultures it absorbed from was Egypt. The serpent on the pole, the Nehushtan, is a direct transplant of Egyptian magical practice into Israelite religion, and it's tied explicitly to Yahweh's command, to his power, to his identity. Yahweh is the God of the serpents, just like Seth. And if you want more proof, look at the book of Job. In Job 26:13 it says, "By his wind the heavens were made fair. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent." Yahweh pierces the serpent. He fights the serpent. He controls the serpent. This is Seth's mythology, word for word. Seth pierces Apep with his spear. He fights the chaos serpent. He controls the forces of the underworld. The fleeing serpent, Nahash Beriach, in Hebrew, is often interpreted as Leviathan, the sea monster, another chaotic serpent creature in Israelite mythology. But the imagery is Egyptian: the combat with the serpent, the piercing with a weapon, the establishment of order through violence against the serpent. All of it comes from Seth. Yahweh didn't just borrow serpent imagery, he inherited it, because he is Seth, reimagined for a new culture, a new people, a new narrative. But the serpent remains, coiled around the pole, burning in the desert, flying in the throne room. The serpent is the mark of Seth, and it's all over Yahweh's mythology. Now, let's talk about names. Because the name of God is the most contested, most manipulated, most deliberately obscured piece of information in all of ancient religious history. And the evidence of that manipulation starts in Egypt. We've already mentioned the Shasu inscriptions, the Egyptian records that mention the land of the Shasu, YHW. These inscriptions come from the reigns of Amenhotep III and Rameses II, dating to the 14th and 13th centuries BCE. They're not Hebrew texts. They're Egyptian administrative records, lists of foreign territories and peoples, and there, carved in stone, is the name YHW. Not YHWH, not the full four-letter tetragrammaton, just three letters, YHW. This is significant for two reasons. First, it proves that the name Yahweh, or at least its protoform, existed before the Israelites supposedly received it at Mount Sinai. Second, it shows that this name was associated with a specific group of people, the Shasu nomads, who lived in the desert regions controlled by Egypt. The Shasu were not Israelites, not yet anyway. They were Bedouin tribes, wandering herders, people who lived on the margins of civilization, and they worshipped a deity whose name was YHW. The scholar Jan Assmann, in his work on monotheism and Egyptian religion, has argued that the origins of Yahwism are deeply connected to these desert nomadic groups and their contact with Egyptian religious culture. But he stops short of identifying which Egyptian god might have influenced or been absorbed into the Yahwistic cult. But the evidence is there, and it points to Seth. Seth's cult was strongest in the regions where the Shasu roamed. The eastern delta, the Sinai, the borderlands between Egypt and the Levant. These were Seth's territories, the Red Land, the desert, the realm of chaos and foreigners. And the Shasu, worshipping their god YHW, were living right in the heart of Seth's domain. But the question remains, if Yahweh really is Seth, why don't we see his name explicitly connected? Why isn't there an inscription that says, Seth equals Yahweh? If you're still here listening, leave a like so we know you're following along, and stay with me as we dive into the next piece of this puzzle. Here's where the name becomes even more important. Because in Egypt, during the later dynasties, Seth's name was erased. This wasn't a gradual decline. It was a deliberate, systematic destruction of Seth's memory. You see, by the time the Israelites began writing their own history, the name Seth had already become toxic. In Egypt, after the fall of the Ramesside dynasty, particularly during the Third Intermediate Period, Seth was vilified. His name was associated with chaos, with the enemies of Egypt, everything they wanted to forget. He became a scapegoat for Egypt's troubles, blamed for chaos, for invasion, for the collapse of the old order. And so his name was chiseled off monuments. His images were defaced. His temples were abandoned or rededicated to other gods. This practice, called Damnatio Memoriae, was the deliberate destruction of a god's memory, of pretending he had never been worshipped at all. Seth's name disappeared from Egypt's religious landscape, but his cult didn't disappear. It moved. It transformed. It found new worshippers among the people who had always been outside Egypt's borders. The Shasu, the nomads, the people who would become the Israelites. And so, when the Israelites carried Seth's cult out of Egypt, they didn't use his Egyptian name. They used the name the Shasu had given him, YHW Yahweh. When you look at the development of the name YHWH, you see traces of this erasure. The name is unique. It doesn't follow the typical patterns of ancient Near Eastern divine names. It's not a compound name like Baal-Hadad or El Shaddai. It's a standalone name derived from the Hebrew root Haya, which means to be. The traditional interpretation is that YHWH means I am who I am, or I cause to be what comes into being. It's a name of pure existence, a name that emphasizes Yahweh's role as creator and sustainer. But that's a later theological interpretation. That's not what the name originally meant. The name YHW, as it appears on the Egyptian inscriptions, doesn't have the extra letter he at the end. It's shorter, more archaic, and it may not have anything to do with the Hebrew root Haya at all. Some scholars have suggested that the name YHW is pre-Hebrew, that it originates from a different linguistic root entirely. The Semitic root *HWY* means to blow or to fall, which would make YHW a storm god, a deity associated with wind and rain. This fits perfectly with the storm god profile of both Seth and early Yahweh. Seth was a god of storms, of the violent desert winds. Yahweh descends in wind and fire, speaks from the whirlwind, rides on the clouds. But the addition of the extra he in YHWH changes the name. It makes it longer, more formal, more ritualized. And it may have been a deliberate alteration, a way of distancing the name from its original associations. In Egypt, he was the god of chaos, the enemy of order, the deity who had been erased. To openly associate Yahweh with Seth would have been dangerous. It would have undermined the entire theological project of Israelite monotheism. And so, the name was changed. Slightly, subtly, just enough to obscure the connection. But the god remained the same. All of it came from Seth. The early Israelites didn't just borrow from Seth, they absorbed him. And then, over centuries, they tried to hide it. They merged him with El, the calm Canaanite creator god, and slowly smoothed out the rough edges. YHW became YHWH. The god of the Shasu became the god of Israel. And Seth's identity was buried beneath layers of new mythology, new theology, new narratives. Yet the traces remain. The scholar Thomas Romer has pointed out that the variation in the spelling of God's name throughout the Hebrew Bible suggests that the name itself was not stable. In some texts, it's YHWH. In others, it's shortened to YH. In the book of Exodus, God even introduces himself with different names to different people, saying that he appeared to Abraham as El Shaddai, but to Moses as YHWH. This isn't just theological subtlety. This is evidence of name change, evidence of deliberate obscuration. The name El Shaddai, God of the mountain, is a Canaanite name connected to the ancient god El. The name YHWH is something else. It's foreign. It's outside the Canaanite pantheon. It's a desert name, a Shasu name, a name from the Red Land. And in the later theological development of Israelite religion, these two names, El and YHWH, were merged. The calm, paternal creator god El was fused with the violent, jealous storm god Yahweh. And the result was the singular monotheistic God of the Hebrew Bible. But the fusion wasn't seamless. You can still see the cracks. You can still see the two personalities fighting for dominance. The God who rests on the seventh day and calls creation good is El. The God who drowns armies, sends plagues, and demands genocide is Yahweh. They're not the same deity. They were never the same deity. They were merged, blended, smoothed over. But underneath, the identity of Yahweh remains. The deliberate erasure of Seth's name in Egypt mirrors the deliberate obscuration of Yahweh's origins in the Hebrew Bible. Both gods were too chaotic, too violent, too associated with foreignness and disorder to be openly acknowledged. And so both names were hidden. Seth's was erased. Yahweh's was changed, formalized, sanitized. But the evidence remains in the Shasu inscriptions, in the storm god iconography, in the desert origins, in the violence and jealousy that characterize early Yahweh. There's another piece of linguistic evidence that's worth mentioning. The Egyptian language doesn't have a direct equivalent for the Hebrew letter Yod, which is the first letter of YHWH. But Egyptian scribes, when writing foreign names, often use the symbol *y* to represent similar sounds. The name YHW, as it appears on the Shasu inscriptions, uses this convention. It's an Egyptianized spelling of a foreign god's name, and the fact that Egyptian scribes recorded this name at all suggests that it was significant, that it was known, that it was worshipped by people within Egypt's sphere of influence. And those people, the Shasu, were living in Seth's territory. The connection is undeniable. The Shasu worshipped YHW. The Shasu lived in the desert regions controlled by Egypt. Those desert regions were Seth's domain, and the cult of Seth, during the Ramesside period, was at its height. If you were a desert nomad in the 13th century BCE, living on the fringes of Egyptian civilization, worshipping a storm god of the wilderness, you were, functionally, worshipping a version of Seth. But the priests and scribes who edited the Torah, who compiled the books of the Hebrew Bible, had a problem. They needed to create a unified, coherent national God. They needed to merge the various local cults, the various regional deities, into a single monotheistic figure. So they took Yahweh, the violent storm god of the south, and they fused him with El, the benevolent creator god of the north, and they buried the Egyptian connection. The names changed, but the god remained the same. The evidence is still there, in the names, in the inscriptions, in the linguistics. We'll come back to this later on. Now let's talk about the war chariot, because if there's one image that defines Yahweh's divine presence, it's the Merkabah, the fiery chariot, the throne of God that moves through the heavens with wheels within wheels, blazing with fire and smoke. And this imagery comes directly from Egyptian military iconography, specifically from Seth. In the book of Ezekiel, the prophet has a vision of God's throne. It's not a peaceful, stationary throne. It's a war machine, 4 living creatures, each with 4 faces, with wheels beside them, wheels full of eyes, moving in any direction without turning. Above them is a platform, and above that, a throne of sapphire, and seated on the throne is a figure of fire. This is the Merkabah, the chariot throne of Yahweh, and it's a direct adaptation of the Egyptian war chariot, the military technology that revolutionized ancient warfare and became a symbol of divine power. The chariot was introduced to Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period by the Hyksos, foreign invaders who conquered the Nile Delta and ruled for over a century. The Hyksos brought with them advanced military technology, composite bows, bronze weapons, and the war chariot. The Egyptians eventually drove out the Hyksos, but they kept the chariot. They perfected it. They made it the centerpiece of their military power, and they associated it with their gods, particularly Seth. Seth, as the god of foreign lands and military strength, became the patron deity of the chariot corps. Egyptian soldiers carved Seth's image onto their chariots and shields. Pharaohs, when they rode into battle, invoked Seth's name. The chariot was Seth's symbol, his instrument of power. And when Yahweh appears in the Hebrew Bible as a divine warrior, he rides a chariot. Psalm 68:17 says, "The chariots of God are twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands. The Lord came from Sinai into the holy place." Chariots, plural, an army of them. This is not metaphorical language. This is military imagery. Yahweh commands a chariot corps, a divine cavalry, an army on wheels. In Habakkuk 3:8, the prophet asks, "Was your wrath against the rivers, O Yahweh? Was your anger against the rivers, or your fury against the sea when you rode on your horses on your chariot of salvation?" Yahweh rides a chariot. He rides horses. He goes into battle like a pharaoh, like an Egyptian king, like a god of war. This is not Canaanite mythology. Baal, the Canaanite storm god, doesn't ride a chariot. He rides clouds. He's depicted standing on a bull, wielding a club and lightning bolts. His imagery is agricultural, tied to the fertility of the land, the coming of rain. Yahweh's imagery is military. It's aggressive. It's Egyptian. The scholar Mark S. Smith has noted that Yahweh absorbed many attributes from Baal during the development of Israelite religion. But the chariot imagery doesn't come from Baal, it comes from Egypt. And in Egypt, the chariot was Seth's domain. The war chariot in ancient Egypt wasn't just a vehicle, it was a symbol of royal and divine power. The pharaoh, riding his chariot, was the earthly embodiment of the god's strength, and the gods themselves were depicted riding chariots into cosmic battle. Seth, in particular, was shown standing on a chariot, armed with a spear, fighting the enemies of Egypt. His role as protector of the pharaoh was directly tied to his association with military power, with the chariot, with the machinery of war. And Yahweh, in his earliest appearances, functions the same way. When Yahweh descends on Mount Sinai in Exodus 19, the mountain shakes, smoke billows, fire blazes, and the sound of a trumpet grows louder and louder. This isn't just a theophany, it's a military arrival. The trumpet, the shofar, was a battle signal. The smoke and fire are the dust and heat of a chariot charge. Yahweh is arriving like an army, like a conqueror, like a pharaoh riding his war chariot into enemy territory. And the Israelites are terrified. They beg Moses to speak to God on their behalf because they're afraid that if they hear God's voice directly, they'll die. This is the fear of soldiers facing an oncoming chariot assault. The noise, the fire, the overwhelming force. Yahweh's presence is a war machine. But the most explicit chariot imagery comes in 2 Kings 2 when the prophet Elijah is taken up to heaven. The text says, "As they still went on and talked, behold, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. Chariots of fire, horses of fire. This is Yahweh's Merkabah. This is the divine war chariot coming to collect his prophet." And the description is almost identical to the Egyptian depictions of divine chariots. Fire, speed, overwhelming power. The chariot is not a peaceful vehicle, it's an instrument of violence, of war, of divine fury. The title Yahweh Tsevaot, usually translated as Lord of Hosts or Lord of Armies, reinforces this military identity. Tsevaot means armies, military forces, organized troops. Yahweh isn't just a god, he's a commander, a general, a pharaoh, and his armies ride chariots. In Egyptian theology, the solar boat of Ra, the vessel that carries the sun god through the sky each day, is sometimes depicted as a chariot. The sun itself is a warrior, fighting the forces of darkness. And Seth, standing at the prow of the boat, is the god who defends Ra, who fights off the serpent Apep, who ensures the sun's victory. Yahweh's Merkabah functions the same way. It's a solar chariot, a vehicle of light and fire, moving through the cosmos, bringing judgment and salvation. The wheels full of eyes, as described in Ezekiel, suggest omniscience, but they also suggest the all-seeing power of a military commander, a god who surveys the battlefield and directs his forces with precision. This is not the imagery of a transcendent, peaceful deity. This is the imagery of a warlord, a god who rides into battle, who commands armies, who crushes enemies beneath his wheels. And the wheels themselves are significant. The war chariot was defined by its wheels, the technological innovation that made it fast, mobile, deadly. The Merkaba's wheels, wheels within wheels, moving in all directions, represent the ultimate evolution of this technology, the perfection of the war machine. Yahweh's throne is not a seat of rest. It's a mobile command center, a chariot that can strike anywhere at any time with overwhelming force. The prophet Isaiah, in chapter 66, describes the coming judgment. For behold, Yahweh will come in fire, and his chariots like the whirlwind, to render his anger in fury, and his rebuke with flames of fire. Fire, chariots, whirlwind, fury. This is the language of war, of invasion, of an army on the move, and it's the language of Seth, Seth, the god of storms and violence, Seth, the god of the war chariot, Seth, the god who brings chaos and destruction to his enemies. The Egyptians, particularly during the Ramesside period, depicted Seth as the ultimate warrior god. He was the god who gave pharaohs their military strength, who ensured victory in battle. His cult was strongest among soldiers, among the chariot corps, among the men who rode into foreign lands and conquered in Egypt's name. And the Shasu, the nomadic tribes who worshipped Yahweh, lived in those foreign lands. They saw Egyptian chariots. They saw Seth's imagery carved into shields and banners. They experienced the terror of Egypt's military power. And when they developed their own religion, when they told stories of their god's might, they used the imagery they knew, the imagery of Egypt, the imagery of Seth. The chariot became Yahweh's throne. The military power became divine power. The terror of the battlefield became the terror of God's presence. But there's one more element to this: the storm. Seth was not just a god of war. He was a god of storms, of thunder and lightning, of the violent desert winds that could blind a man, strip flesh from bone, bury entire armies in sand. And Yahweh is described the same way. Psalm 18 says, "He rode on a cherub and flew. He came swiftly on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, thick clouds dark with water. Out of the brightness before him, hailstones and coals of fire broke through his clouds. Yahweh also thundered in the heavens, and the Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire." This is a storm god, flying on the wind, surrounded by dark clouds, hurling hailstones and fire, thundering from the heavens. But he's not just a storm god. He's a storm god on a chariot. The cherub he rides is not a cute angel. The Hebrew word keruv refers to a powerful winged creature, often depicted in ancient Near Eastern art as a griffin or sphinx. These creatures pulled divine chariots. They were the horses of the gods. Yahweh rides a chariot pulled by cherubim, surrounded by storm clouds, hurling fire and lightning. This is Seth's iconography: storm, chariot, violence, chaos. The Egyptian depictions of Seth show him as the master of the desert storm, the god who brings the violent winds that destroy crops, bury cities, obliterate armies. His presence is announced by thunder, by the roar of the tempest. And Yahweh's presence is announced the same way. When Yahweh speaks to Job from the whirlwind, he doesn't speak gently. He doesn't comfort. He overwhelms. He reminds Job of his cosmic power, his ability to command the storm, to unleash destruction, to reduce human beings to insignificance. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, that a flood of waters may cover you? Can you send forth lightnings, that they may go and say to you, "Here we are"? This is the voice of the storm god, the god who controls lightning, who commands the clouds, who brings the flood. And the chariot ties it all together. Because the war chariot in ancient warfare was the platform from which archers fired arrows, from which commanders directed troops, from which kings displayed their power. It was mobile, fast, terrifying. And when you combine the chariot with the storm, you get the ultimate expression of divine power. A God who moves like lightning, who strikes like thunder, who appears suddenly and overwhelms his enemies. This is the Merkaba. This is Yahweh's throne. This is Seth's war machine, transplanted into Israelite theology. The title Lord of Hosts, Yahweh Tsevaot, makes perfect sense in this context. Yahweh is the commander of the chariot corps. He leads the armies of heaven. He rides at the head of the divine cavalry. And the Israelites, when they went to war, invoked this imagery. They called on Yahweh to ride out with them, to bring his chariots of fire to crush their enemies. This is not the God of peace. This is not the God of love. The war chariot, the storm, the military power, the overwhelming violence, all of it points back to the Egyptian god of chaos, the deity who rode into battle, who commanded the desert winds, who brought destruction to anyone who stood in his way. Yahweh inherited Seth's chariot, and he's been riding it ever since. Now we need to talk about the tabernacle, because the design of Yahweh's dwelling place is one of the most overlooked pieces of evidence connecting him to Seth. The tabernacle, the Mishkan, was not a temple. It was a tent, a portable shrine, designed to be assembled, disassembled, and carried through the wilderness. And according to the book of Exodus, Yahweh gave Moses exact specifications for how to build it. But these specifications aren't unique. They're not divinely original. They're Egyptian. The tabernacle was a rectangular structure made of wooden frames covered with layers of fabric and animal skins. Inside was a courtyard, an outer chamber called the Holy Place, and an inner chamber called the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. This design, this portable shrine, matches the structure of Egyptian military tent shrines used by pharaohs during campaigns in foreign territories. When an Egyptian army marched into the desert, into the Red Land, into Seth's domain, they brought their gods with them. Not in permanent temples, but in portable shrines, tent structures that could be moved with the army, set up at each camp, and taken down when they moved on. These military shrines were rectangular, with a courtyard, an outer chamber, and an inner sanctum where the god's image was kept. They were constructed with wooden frames and covered with fabric. They were designed to be functional, mobile, and defensible. The tabernacle follows the same blueprint. The scholar Michael Homan, in his work, To Your Tents, O Israel, has documented the architectural parallels between the Israelite tabernacle and Egyptian military tent shrines. He points out that the dimensions, the materials, the layout, and even the decorative elements of the tabernacle match Egyptian prototypes. The use of acacia wood, which grew in the Sinai desert, is significant. This was the wood used in Egyptian desert construction. The layers of fabric and animal skins, the goat hair curtains, the ram skins dyed red, all of these materials were standard in Egyptian military tents. But the most significant parallel is the orientation and function of the tabernacle. It wasn't just a place of worship. It was a command center. A place where Yahweh met with Moses, where strategic decisions were made, where the covenant was kept. This is exactly the function of the Egyptian military tent shrine. It was the pharaoh's headquarters, the place where he consulted with the gods, where he received divine guidance for battle. Yahweh's tabernacle was a war tent, and Seth, as the god of the Egyptian military, was the deity most associated with these portable desert shrines. During the Ramesside period, when the Egyptian army was at its peak, Seth's cult was intimately connected with military campaigns. Soldiers carried images of Seth with them into battle. Pharaohs erected temporary shrines to Seth in conquered territories. The desert campaigns, the wars against foreign enemies, were conducted under Seth's protection. And the Shasu, The nomadic tribes who worshipped YHW would have seen these shrines. They would have witnessed Egyptian religious practice in the desert. They would have observed how the Egyptians transported their gods through hostile territory. And when they developed their own religious practices, they copied what they saw. The tabernacle is not a Canaanite structure. Canaanite temples were permanent, built of stone, located on hilltops or in city centers. They were agricultural temples, tied to the land, to the cycles of planting and harvest. The tabernacle is nomadic, desert-based, military. It's Egyptian, but the interior design of the tabernacle reveals even more. Inside the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum, was the Ark of the Covenant, a gold-covered wooden chest with 2 golden cherubim on top, their wings spread over the mercy seat, the place where Yahweh's presence dwelt. This design, the chest with winged creatures, is directly borrowed from Egyptian sacred furniture. In Egyptian temples and royal tombs, sacred objects were often kept in wooden chests, flanked by protective winged goddesses. The most famous example is the Shrine of Tutankhamun, where the canopic chest is protected by 4 goddesses with outstretched wings. The Ark of the Covenant follows the same design. The cherubim, with their wings spread over the Ark, are the Hebrew version of the Egyptian protective goddesses. The function is identical: to guard the sacred object, to mark the presence of the divine. But there's another element to the Ark that's often overlooked. It was carried on poles. The poles were inserted through rings on the sides of the Ark, and the Levites carried it on their shoulders as the Israelites traveled through the wilderness. This is exactly how Egyptian sacred objects were transported. In Egyptian religious processions, the god's image was placed in a portable shrine called a bark, which was carried on poles by priests. The bark was a boat-shaped container, symbolizing the solar boat of Ra, but it functioned the same way as the Ark, a portable container for the god's presence. The Ark of the Covenant was the Hebrew version of the Egyptian sacred bark, portable, carried by priests, representing the presence of the God in motion. And the God in motion, the God of the wilderness, the God who traveled with the army, was Seth. The tabernacle's courtyard contained 2 main objects: the bronze altar for burnt offerings and the bronze basin for ritual washing. Both of these objects have Egyptian parallels. In Egyptian temples, the altar was the place where offerings were made to the gods. The basin, the kekeret, was used for ritual purification before priests could approach the inner sanctum. The tabernacle's layout mirrors this exactly. But the materials are significant. Bronze was the metal of military technology. Bronze weapons, bronze shields, bronze chariots. The use of bronze in the tabernacle's courtyard is not accidental. It reinforces the military character of the structure. This is not a temple of peace. This is a war camp shrine. The curtains that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies were embroidered with cherubim, winged creatures. These curtains were not just decorative. They represented a barrier, a threshold between the human realm and the divine presence. In Egyptian temples, similar curtains separated the outer chambers from the inner sanctum where the god's image was kept. Only the high priest could pass beyond the curtain. Only he could enter the presence of the god. The tabernacle replicated this structure. The high priest, once a year on Yom Kippur, could enter the Holy of Holies and stand before the Ark, before the presence of Yahweh. This is Egyptian temple protocol, adapted for a desert setting. But here's where the Seth connection becomes undeniable. The tabernacle was set up in the wilderness, in the desert, in the Red Land. It was not a permanent structure. It was designed for chaos, for movement, for survival in hostile territory. And Seth was the god of the wilderness, the god of the desert, the God of places where nothing grew, where danger lurked, where only the strong survived. The tabernacle was Seth's kind of shrine, portable, defensive, military. The Israelites, wandering through the Sinai, carrying their tent shrine, worshipping a god who dwelt in a portable box, were practicing a form of religion that was fundamentally Egyptian. They were replicating the military religious practices of the Egyptian army, the practices associated with Seth's cult. And when they finally entered Canaan, they didn't build a temple immediately. The tabernacle remained their primary religious structure for generations. It was set up at Shiloh, at Gilgal, moving from place to place, still portable, still temporary. Only when David captured Jerusalem and Solomon built the first temple did Yahweh finally get a permanent home. And even then, the temple's design incorporated elements of the tabernacle: the Holy of Holies, the Ark, the curtains, the cherubim. The temple was the tabernacle translated into stone, but the original blueprint came from Egypt. The portable nature of the tabernacle also reflects Seth's mythology. Seth was never a god of cities, of civilization, of permanence. He was a god of movement, of transition, of the spaces between settled lands. The Israelites, during their wilderness period, were living in Seth's world, nomadic, unstable, constantly on the move. And their God, Yahweh, moved with them, dwelling in a tent, traveling through the chaos. This is not the behavior of a universal creator God. This is the behavior of a tribal deity, a god attached to a specific people, moving with them through hostile territory. And it's exactly Seth's profile. Seth was the god of foreigners, of people outside the borders, of tribes that didn't belong to Egypt's settled civilization. The tabernacle was the physical manifestation of this theology, a god who couldn't be tied down, a god who lived in a tent, a god who moved through the desert. The materials of the tabernacle also reveal its desert character: acacia wood, animal skins, goat hair, bronze. These were not the materials of wealthy temple construction. They were the materials of survival, of military campaigns, of desert life. The golden elements, the gold that covered the ark and the cherubim, came from Egypt. According to Exodus, the Israelites plundered gold from the Egyptians before they left. They took Egypt's wealth and used it to build Yahweh's shrine. This is a deliberate reversal. The gold of Egypt, the symbol of Ra's solar power, was repurposed to glorify Yahweh, the God of the desert, the God of chaos. But the gold was just a veneer. Underneath, the tabernacle was wood and fabric and bronze. It was a desert structure, built for the Red Land, designed to survive in Seth's domain. And it worked. The tabernacle functioned for centuries as the center of Israelite worship. It proved that a god didn't need a permanent temple to be powerful. He just needed a tent, a portable shrine, a place where his presence could dwell among his people no matter where they went. This is the genius of the tabernacle. It was adaptable, mobile, resilient, just like Seth, just like Yahweh. The tabernacle was the architectural blueprint of chaos cult, a shrine for a god who couldn't be contained, who refused to settle, who demanded constant movement, constant vigilance, constant sacrifice. And when you stand in the desert, when you imagine the Israelites camped around this tent shrine, when you picture the smoke from the altar rising into the dry air, you're seeing the cult of Seth transplanted into a new people, a new narrative, a new name. But the structure remains: the tent of chaos, the portable throne of the desert god. Yahweh's tabernacle was Seth's shrine, and the blueprint proves it. Now, here's another piece of the puzzle: the Exodus. The entire story, the plagues, the Red Sea, the defeat of Pharaoh, is a cosmic battle between two religious systems. And when you look closely, it's not a battle between good and evil. It's a battle between Seth and the gods of Egypt. The Exodus narrative is structured as a series of confrontations between Yahweh and Pharaoh. But on a deeper level, it's a confrontation between Yahweh and the Egyptian divine order. Each plague targets a specific aspect of Egyptian religious life, a specific god, a specific element of cosmic stability, and Yahweh wins every time. But here's the twist. Yahweh doesn't win as an outsider. He wins as Seth, the chaos god, the deity who was always destined to overthrow the established order. The first plague turns the Nile to blood. The Nile wasn't just a river. It was the lifeblood of Egypt, the source of fertility, the manifestation of the god Hapi. To turn the Nile to blood was to kill Egypt's primary deity, to corrupt the source of life itself. This is Seth's move. Seth, in his mythology, is the murderer, the one who brings death where there should be life. The blood in the Nile is Seth's signature, his mark of chaos. The second plague brings frogs swarming out of the Nile, invading homes, ovens, kneading bowls. Frogs were associated with the goddess Heket, a deity of fertility and childbirth. To unleash frogs as a plague was to corrupt Heket's power, to turn fertility into infestation. Seth's mythology is all about corruption. He takes what should be good and twists it into horror. The third plague brings gnats or lice, biting insects that swarm over humans and animals. This targets the priests, who were required to be ritually pure, completely clean, in order to serve the gods. If they're covered in lice, they can't perform their duties. The temples become inoperative. This is an attack on Egypt's entire religious infrastructure, and it's exactly what Seth would do. Seth had no respect for religious order, for priestly ritual, for the ceremonies that maintained cosmic stability. The fourth plague brings swarms of flies. The fifth kills the livestock. The sixth causes boils on humans and animals. Each plague escalates, each one targeting a different aspect of Egyptian life, a different source of stability, and each one is an act of pure chaos. The seventh plague brings hail mixed with fire, a meteorological impossibility, a storm so violent that it destroys crops, kills livestock, and terrifies the Egyptians. This is a storm god's plague, a display of raw atmospheric power, and Seth was the storm god of Egypt. He commanded the violent desert tempests, the winds that could strip flesh from bone. The eighth plague brings locusts, devouring everything the hail didn't destroy. Locusts were a natural disaster in the ancient world, but in the Exodus narrative, they're commanded by Yahweh, unleashed as a weapon. Seth's association with desert creatures, with the chaotic fauna of the wilderness, makes locusts a perfect weapon for him. The ninth plague brings darkness, 3 days of absolute blackness. This is the most theologically significant plague because it directly attacks Ra, the sun god, the supreme deity of Egypt. If Ra can't bring light, if the sun fails to rise, then Egypt's entire cosmic order collapses, and Seth, in his mythology, was the one who threatened Ra every night. Seth fought the serpent Apep, yes, but he was also associated with the forces of darkness, with the chaos that tried to prevent Ra's resurrection each dawn. The ninth plague is Seth's ultimate victory. The sun fails. Darkness wins. Egypt's god-king is powerless. And then comes the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. This is the most brutal, most personal, most devastating plague. Every firstborn son in Egypt, from the pharaoh's palace to the prisoner's cell, dies in a single night. Only the Israelites who marked their doorposts with lamb's blood are spared. This is not the act of a benevolent God. This is genocide. This is the indiscriminate slaughter of children to break a king's will, and it's exactly Seth's mythology. Seth was the murderer of children, the killer of innocence. In the Osiris myth, Seth's violence extends to Osiris's son Horus, whom Seth tries to kill multiple times. The 10th plague is Seth's defining act, the murder of the innocent to assert dominance. But the Exodus doesn't end with the plagues. It ends with the Red Sea. The crossing of the Red Sea, or more accurately, the Reed Sea, is the climactic moment of the Exodus story. Pharaoh's army pursues the fleeing Israelites, trapping them against the water. Moses raises his staff, and Yahweh parts the sea, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry ground. When the Egyptians follow, the waters return, drowning the entire army. This is cosmic warfare, Yahweh versus Pharaoh, the god of chaos versus the god-king of order. But look at the details. The sea is parted by wind. Exodus 14:21 says, Yahweh drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land. Wind, the desert wind, the storm. This is Seth's power. Seth commanded the desert winds, the violent gales that could reshape the landscape, bury cities, clear paths through the wilderness. The parting of the sea is a storm god's miracle. It's not a gentle act of creation. It's a violent manipulation of nature, a forced reshaping of the world. And when the Egyptians enter the seabed, the waters return and drown them. This is not a passive defense. This is an attack. Yahweh actively kills the Egyptian army, crushing them beneath the weight of the sea. The text says in Exodus 14:27, the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. As the Egyptians fled into it, Yahweh threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. Yahweh threw them, active voice, deliberate violence. This is Seth, the warrior, the killer. Seth, the chaos god who drowns his enemies. But there's another layer to this. In Egyptian mythology, Seth's great enemy was Osiris, the god of order, fertility, and the Nile. Osiris represented everything stable, everything civilized, everything Egyptian, and in the Exodus, Pharaoh is the embodiment of Osiris. He's the god-king, the representative of divine order on earth. He sits on Horus's throne, ruling in Osiris's name. When Yahweh defeats Pharaoh, he's not just defeating a human king. He's defeating Osiris. He's overthrowing the entire Egyptian divine order. This is Seth's revenge. Seth, who murdered Osiris and tore his body apart, is finally completing his victory. Through Yahweh, Seth destroys Egypt's god-king and proves that chaos is stronger than order. The Song of Moses, sung after the crossing of the Red Sea, reinforces this. Exodus 15:1-3 says, I will sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. Yahweh is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. Yahweh is a man of war. Yahweh is his name. A man of war, not a God of peace, not a God of mercy. A warrior, a God who throws horses and riders into the sea. This is Seth's victory song, and the Israelites are singing it. But the Exodus narrative doesn't just show Yahweh as Seth fighting Egypt. It also shows the Israelites absorbing Seth's identity. After the Red Sea crossing, the Israelites wander in the desert for 40 years. They live in the Red Land in Seth's domain. They become nomads, wanderers, outsiders. They worship a God who dwells in a tent, who speaks from the wilderness, who gives them laws on a desert mountain. They become Seth's people, and their identity is forged in opposition to Egypt. They define themselves as not Egyptian, as the people who escaped, who survived, who conquered through chaos rather than order. This is a Sethian narrative. Seth was always the outsider, the foreign god, the deity of people beyond Egypt's borders, and the Israelites, after the Exodus, are definitively foreign. They're no longer part of Egypt. They're something else, something wilder, something chaotic. The golden calf incident, which happens while Moses is on Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments, is often interpreted as a relapse into idolatry. But look at what the Israelites create: a bull calf, covered in gold. The bull was Seth's enemy in some myths, associated with Osiris and agricultural fertility. But in other contexts, the bull was a symbol of strength and power, used by multiple Egyptian gods. The golden calf is the Israelites trying to recreate Egyptian religious practice. They're making an idol like the ones they saw in Egypt. They're trying to go back to what they knew, and Yahweh's response is fury. He wants to destroy them all. Only Moses' intervention saves them. This isn't just about idolatry. This is about identity. Yahweh demands that the Israelites be different from Egypt, that they worship differently, that they reject Egyptian forms. But Yahweh himself is Egyptian. He's Seth, disguised under a new name commanding a new people. The irony is devastating. The God who leads Israel out of Egypt is an Egyptian God. The God who demands rejection of Egyptian idolatry is built from Egyptian mythology. And the Exodus story, this grand narrative of liberation, is actually the story of Seth's final victory over the Egyptian divine order. Seth, through Yahweh, escapes Egypt. He takes his people, the Shasu, the desert nomads, and he leads them out of the land that rejected him, that erased his name, that tried to destroy his memory. And he establishes a new cult, a new religion in the wilderness. A religion where he is no longer the chaos god fighting for recognition among many deities. He is the only God, the sole deity, the jealous, wrathful, all-powerful Yahweh. The Exodus is Seth's origin story, rewritten as liberation theology. But the evidence of Seth's presence throughout the Exodus narrative is overwhelming. The violence, the plagues, the storm, the drowning of armies, the blood, the death, the chaos. Every element points back to the Egyptian god of the Red Land, the deity of destruction and disorder. And the geographical details confirm it. The Exodus route, as described in the Bible, goes through the Sinai Peninsula, the exact territory where the Shasu worshipped YHW, the exact region where Seth's cult was strongest during the Ramesside period. The Israelites don't travel north through Canaan, taking the direct route. They go south, into the deep desert, into Seth's heartland. They spend 40 years wandering through territory that belonged to Egypt, that was patrolled by Egyptian forces, that was dotted with Egyptian military outposts and Seth shrines. This is not a story of escape from Egypt. This is a story of transformation within Egypt's sphere of influence. The Israelites become Sethian nomads, worshipping the desert god, practicing desert religion, living the desert life, and when they finally enter Canaan, they bring Seth with them. They bring Yahweh, they bring the violence, the jealousy, the storm, the serpent, the war chariot, the tent shrine. They bring all of it. The conquest of Canaan, as described in the book of Joshua, is genocidal. City after city is destroyed. Populations are slaughtered. The land is cleansed of its inhabitants to make room for the Israelites. And Yahweh commands it all. He orders the violence. He demands the bloodshed. He promises the land to his people, and the price is the annihilation of everyone already living there. This is not the God of love. This is not the God of the Sermon on the Mount. The Exodus narrative, from beginning to end, is a Sethian myth. It's the story of how a chaos god overthrew the established order, claimed a people for himself, and established a new religious system based on exclusive worship, violent conquest, and absolute obedience. And the most shocking part? The Israelites never realized they were worshiping an Egyptian god. Or if they did, they buried that knowledge so deep that it's taken archaeologists and scholars thousands of years to uncover it. The Shasu inscriptions prove that YHW was worshipped before Moses. The geographical evidence proves that Yahweh's origins are in the Egyptian-controlled Sinai. The iconographic evidence proves that Yahweh's attributes match Seth's perfectly. And the Exodus narrative itself, when you strip away the theological overlay, is a cosmic battle between Seth and the Egyptian divine order, a battle that Seth wins by drowning Pharaoh's army and leading his people into the desert. The Exodus is not a story about freedom. It's a story about Seth's revenge, about a chaos god reclaiming his power, asserting his dominance, and establishing himself as the sole deity of a wandering desert tribe. And that tribe, those desert nomads who followed Seth out of Egypt, became the Israelites. They became the people of Yahweh. They became the founders of monotheism. But underneath it all, beneath the centuries of theological development, beneath the layers of later editing and reinterpretation, the truth remains. All of it points back to one terrifying conclusion. Yahweh's original identity wasn't Hebrew. The Exodus is Seth's story. The God of the Bible was Egyptian, and it was Seth. Now we come to the final piece of the puzzle, the great deception, the merger, the moment when Seth became invisible, when his identity was buried so deep that it took millennia to uncover. The transformation of Yahweh from a violent desert storm god into the universal creator. God of monotheism wasn't a revelation. It was a political and theological project that took centuries to complete, and it required erasing Seth's fingerprints from every surface. Here's what happened. During the early period of Israelite religion, roughly from 1200 to 800 BCE, Yahweh was not the only God the Israelites worshipped. He was the primary God, the national deity, but he existed within a pantheon. The archaeological evidence is clear. Inscriptions found at Kuntilat Adrud and Khirbet el-Qom, dating to the 8th century BCE, mention Yahweh and his Asherah. Asherah was a Canaanite goddess, the consort of El, the father god of the Canaanite pantheon. This means that, as late as the 8th century BCE, Yahweh was worshipped alongside a female deity. He had a consort. He was part of a divine family. This is not monotheism. This is polytheism, or at least monolatry, the worship of one primary god while acknowledging the existence of others. But something changed. During the late 7th century BCE, during the reign of King Josiah, a religious reform swept through Judah. The reformers centralized worship in Jerusalem, destroyed local shrines, purged foreign religious elements, and promoted a new theology. Yahweh alone is God. There are no other gods. Asherah is gone. The pantheon is gone. Only Yahweh remains. This is the birth of true monotheism, and it required massive textual revision. As mentioned earlier, the priests and scribes who compiled the Torah during and after the Babylonian exile had a problem. The old stories, the old traditions, were full of polytheistic elements, references to other gods. Stories where Yahweh acts like a tribal deity competing with other deities. Mythology that didn't fit the new monotheistic framework. So they edited, they rewrote, they merged. And the most important merger was the fusion of Yahweh with El. El was the ancient Canaanite creator god, the calm, paternal figure who presided over the divine council. He was depicted as an old man with a white beard, seated on a throne, wise and benevolent. He was the father of the gods, the source of order and stability. El's mythology is completely different from Yahweh's. El doesn't storm, he doesn't rage, he doesn't demand genocide. He's the peaceful creator, the god of wisdom and cosmic order. But the biblical editors took El's attributes and grafted them onto Yahweh. They took El's role as creator and assigned it to Yahweh. They took El's title, El Shaddai, and made it one of Yahweh's names. They took El's divine counsel and made it Yahweh's heavenly court. And slowly, over centuries of theological development, Yahweh absorbed El completely. The two gods merged into one, but the merger wasn't seamless. You can still see the cracks. Genesis 1, the first creation account, describes a calm, orderly creation process. God speaks and things come into existence. Let there be light, and there is light. It's peaceful, methodical, divine. This is El's creation myth, the serene creator bringing order to chaos through speech alone. But Genesis 2, the second creation account, is different. God forms Adam from dust, plants a garden, creates animals, performs surgery on Adam to create Eve. It's hands-on, physical, intimate. And then Genesis 3 shows God walking in the garden, calling out to Adam, angry that he's eaten from the forbidden tree. God makes clothes for Adam and Eve. He curses the serpent. He expels them from Eden with cherubim and a flaming sword guarding the gate. This is not the serene creator of Genesis 1. This is a different God. A God with emotions, with physicality, with a temper. This is Yahweh. This is Seth. The two creation accounts represent two different theological traditions, clumsily stitched together by later editors who wanted to create a unified narrative. But they couldn't hide the seams. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, you see this tension, the calm, universal creator versus the violent, jealous storm god. The God who rests on the seventh day versus the God who sends plagues and drowns armies. These are not the same deity. They were never the same deity. El was the creator, Yahweh was the warrior, and the biblical editors tried to merge them into a single monotheistic figure. But Yahweh's personality, Seth's personality, kept breaking through. The jealousy, the wrath, the demand for exclusive worship, the violence, the intolerance, and no amount of theological revision could completely erase them. The scholar Mark S. Smith, in The Early History of God, documents this merger extensively. He shows how Yahweh gradually absorbed the attributes of El, Baal, and other Canaanite deities, becoming a composite god who combined multiple mythological traditions. But Smith doesn't fully address the Egyptian element. He doesn't trace Yahweh's origins back to Seth, because to acknowledge that connection would be to admit that the God of the Bible, the foundation of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is an Egyptian chaos god, repackaged and sanitized for a new audience. The monotheistic revolution of the late Israelite period wasn't a divine revelation. It was a political necessity. After the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians in 722 BCE, and the constant threat to Judah from surrounding empires, the religious leaders needed to create a unified, powerful national identity. And the best way to do that was to promote one God, one temple, one religious system. So they took Yahweh, the violent storm god of the southern deserts, and they merged him with El, the calm creator god of the Canaanite highlands. They took his violent mythology and reinterpreted it as divine justice. They took his jealousy and called it righteousness. They took his intolerance and made it a theological principle, and they buried his origins by erasing the Egyptian connection. They removed any reference to Seth, to the Shasu, to the desert cult that gave birth to Yahwism. The Book of Deuteronomy, likely written during Josiah's reforms, explicitly forbids worship of other gods, forbids intermarriage with foreigners, forbids anything that might dilute Yahweh's exclusive claim on Israelite loyalty. This is not ancient tradition. This is recent innovation, designed to create a religious system that could survive in a hostile world. And it worked. Monotheistic Yahwism survived the Babylonian exile, survived the destruction of the temple, survived the scattering of the Jewish people. But the cost was the erasure of the truth. Yahweh's original identity, his Egyptian origins, his connection to Seth, all of it was buried beneath centuries of theological editing and reinterpretation. And the personality traits that didn't fit the new monotheistic framework, the violence, the jealousy, the intolerance, were reinterpreted as divine attributes rather than remnants of a chaos god's temperament. The Old Testament God, the God of wrath and judgment, is not a universal creator. He's Seth, incompletely merged with El, still displaying his original personality despite centuries of theological smoothing. When God floods the world in Genesis, killing every living thing except Noah's family, that's Seth. Seth the destroyer, Seth the bringer of chaos. When God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah with fire and brimstone, that's Seth. Seth the storm god, Seth the wielder of destructive power. When God orders the genocide of the Canaanites, commanding the Israelites to leave no survivors, that's Seth. Seth the warrior, Seth the god who recognizes no moral limits. These stories don't make sense if Yahweh is a benevolent, all-loving creator. They only make sense if Yahweh is Seth, a chaos god whose fundamental nature is violence and destruction. The later prophets tried to soften this image. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel all promoted a more universal, more merciful vision of God. They emphasized justice, compassion, care for the poor and oppressed. But they couldn't erase the old stories. They couldn't rewrite the Torah. So the violent, jealous Seth Yahweh remained right alongside the prophetic vision of a just and merciful God. And this tension, this fundamental contradiction, has haunted theology for millennia. Christian theology tried to resolve it by splitting God into Old Testament and New Testament versions. The God of wrath versus the God of love. The law versus grace. The violent father versus the peaceful son. But this is just another version of the El-Yahweh merger, another attempt to reconcile the incompatible personalities of two different gods. Jesus, in the Gospels, explicitly challenges some of the Old Testament commands. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye. But I say to you, turn the other cheek. And this isn't just ethical development. This is Jesus rejecting Seth's morality, Seth's violence, Seth's demand for retribution. Jesus is trying to bring back El, the compassionate Father, the merciful Creator, the God who loves rather than destroys. But the church couldn't fully abandon Yahweh, couldn't fully abandon Seth. So they kept both. The Trinity became a way to hold contradictory divine personalities in a single theological framework. But the truth is simpler and more disturbing. The God of the Old Testament is the Egyptian chaos god, absorbed into Israelite religion, merged with El, sanitized and universalized, but never fully transformed. And every time someone asks, why is the Old Testament God so violent? They're asking the wrong question. The right question is, why did the Israelites worship Seth? And the answer is, because he was the God of their origins, the God of the Shasu, the God of the desert, the God who led them out of Egypt, through the wilderness, into the promised land. They worshipped Seth because Seth was their God. And when they became monotheists, when they eliminated all other deities, they couldn't eliminate him, so they transformed him. They merged him with El. They called him the Creator. They made him the foundation of monotheism. But underneath the theological overlay, underneath the centuries of revision and reinterpretation, Seth remains jealous, violent, chaotic, intolerant. Benidra. The God of the Bible, the foundation of the world's three largest monotheistic religions, is not who we thought he was. He's not a timeless, universal creator who revealed himself to the Israelites on Mount Sinai, and the evidence is overwhelming. The Shasu inscriptions prove that YHW was worshipped in the Egyptian-controlled Sinai before the biblical Exodus. The geographical evidence places Yahweh's origins in Seth's territory, the Red Land, the desert regions between Egypt and Canaan. The iconographic evidence is undeniable. The serpents, the fiery seraphim, the bronze Nehushtan, the war chariot, the storm imagery, the Merkaba throne. All of it comes from Egyptian religious symbolism, specifically from Seth's cult. The architectural evidence shows that the tabernacle was designed like an Egyptian military tent shrine, portable and defensive, built for the desert, for Seth's domain. The narrative evidence reveals that the Exodus story is a cosmic battle between Seth and the Egyptian divine order, a battle that Seth wins by drowning Pharaoh's army and leading his people into the wilderness. And the theological evidence exposes the great deception, the merger of Yahweh with El, the transformation of a violent chaos god into a universal creator, the centuries-long project of erasing Seth's Egyptian origins and repackaging him as the one true God of monotheism. So here we are, at the end of the journey, standing in the desert, staring at the evidence, unable to unsee what we've discovered. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God of the Shasu. Deliberately obscured by religious authorities who knew that acknowledging Yahweh's Egyptian origins would undermine the entire monotheistic project. But they couldn't erase him completely. All of Seth's attributes, embedded deep in the DNA of biblical theology, impossible to remove without destroying the entire structure. And this explains so much. It explains why the Old Testament God is so violent, why he demands exclusive worship, why he's described as jealous and wrathful. It explains the serpent imagery, the Nehushtan, the seraphim in the throne room, the war chariot, the storm theophanies, the military language of Lord of Hosts. It explains the tabernacle, the portable tent shrine designed for the desert, for nomadic life, for Seth's Red Land. The Exodus narrative, the plagues, the drowning of Pharaoh's army, the 40 years in the wilderness. It explains everything that doesn't make sense if Yahweh is supposed to be a universal, all-loving creator, because he's not. Every time you read the Old Testament, you'll see Seth. He's there. He's always been there. And the most disturbing part? This truth has been hidden in plain sight for over 3,000 years, until now. Consider the implications. 3 major world religions, billions of believers, thousands of years of theology, all built on the foundation of an Egyptian chaos god who was repackaged, sanitized, and universalized. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all trace their origins to the God of the Hebrew Bible. They all claim descent from Abraham, from Moses, from the covenant made in the wilderness. But that covenant was made with Seth, and his personality, his fundamental nature has shaped these religions in profound ways. This is the secret they've been hiding. Everything you thought you knew about monotheism, about divine revelation, about the origins of Western religion is built on a foundation of erasure. But now you know. Now you've seen the evidence. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every piece of evidence points to the same conclusion. The God of the Bible was Egyptian. Yahweh's true name was Seth. And the greatest deception in religious history was making you forget. If this journey has opened your eyes, do me a favor. Leave a like. Subscribe to Sleep Mysteries. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this truth. Because this isn't just ancient history. This is the secret that shapes billions of lives. And it's time for the truth to come out. Until next time, sweet dreams and keep questioning. Good night.